Can one man's foolish decision to party lead to the destruction of an entire town? This is the unbelievable story of James Scot and the Great Flood of 1993. It is a case that has everything: a natural disaster of historic proportions, a bizarre motive, and a conviction that many believe was a grave miscarriage of justice. Let's rewind to July 1993. The Mississippi River was raging, swollen by months of relentless rain. This event would later be known as the Great Flood of 1993, one of the most devastating floods in American history. Along the riverbanks, towns were in a desperate fight against the rising water. One of those towns was West Quincy, Missouri, protected by a large earthen levee. Volunteers worked around the clock, sandbagging, patrolling, and praying the levee would hold. Among them was a man named James Scot. He was known around town, but not necessarily for the best reasons. He had a reputation for being a bit of a troublemaker, with a history of petty crimes and a habit of drinking heavily. But on that fateful night, he was just another body on the levee, supposedly helping to save his community. Then the unthinkable happened. The levee broke. A wall of water, powerful and unstoppable, surged through. The breach, within hours, the entire town of West Quincy was submerged. Businesses, homes, farms, everything was wiped out. The destruction was absolute, with damages running into the millions. The town was, for all intents and purposes, gone. In the chaotic aftermath, as people tried to piece together what happened, a shocking story began to emerge. Investigators started looking not at a natural failure, but at a deliberate act of sabotage, and their attention quickly focused on one of the volunteers, James Scot. According to prosecutors, Scot wasn't a hero that night. He was the villain. They painted a picture of a man who intentionally caused the disaster. Their theory was that Scot, wanting to get away from his wife for a night of partying, came up with a truly reckless plan. His wife was on the other side of the river, and the bridge connecting the two areas was about to be closed due to the flooding. The prosecution argued that Scott deliberately weakened the levee to ensure the bridge would be inaccessible. By flooding the town, he would effectively strand his wife, giving him the perfect excuse to go out drinking and carousing with his friends. It's a motive so bizarre, so disproportionate to the consequences, that it's almost hard to believe. Could someone really doom an entire town just so they could have a night out? This motive became the centerpiece of the trial. Prosecutors presented witnesses who claimed Scott had talked about breaking a levee. They pointed to his past criminal record and his reputation as an irresponsible individual. They argued he had the opportunity and the twisted incentive to commit the crime. In 1994, a jury agreed. James Scott was convicted of intentionally causing a catastrophe and sentenced to life in prison. Case closed, right? A bad guy got what he deserved, and justice was served. Well, not quite. This is where the story gets even more complicated and controversial. From the very beginning, there were huge problems with the case against James Scott. The most glaring issue was the complete lack of physical evidence. There were no fingerprints, no footprints, no tools, nothing that directly tied Scott to the levee. Breach: the spot where the levee failed was under tons of water and mud, making a proper forensic investigation almost impossible. The entire case rested on circumstantial evidence and, most importantly, witness testimony, and that testimony was shaky at best. The main witness who testified against Scott was a man who was facing his own legal troubles. He received a significantly reduced sentence on unrelated charges in exchange for his testimony. This is a common practice in the legal system, but it always raises questions about whether the witness is telling the truth or just saying what the prosecution wants to hear to save themselves. Other witnesses gave conflicting accounts, and some later recanted their stories. Then there's the levee itself. Was it really a sturdy structure, brought down by one man? Or was it an accident waiting to happen? Many experts and engineers who have studied the case believe the levee was already in a precarious state. It was a temporary, poorly constructed earthen wall, saturated with water and under immense pressure from the historic flood. Hundreds of other levees failed up and down the Mississippi and Missouri rivers during that same flood. Some engineers argued that the West Quincy levee was almost certainly going to fail anyway, regardless of what James Scott did or didn't do. They pointed to evidence of sand boils, a natural phenomenon where water pressure from underneath pushes sand and water up to the surface, indicating a severely weakened levee structure. So the defense's argument was simple. James Scot was a scapegoat. In the face of a massive, uncontrollable natural disaster, people needed someone to blame, and Scot, with his checkered past and unlikable personality, was the perfect target. The trial, they argued, became less about finding the truth and more about convicting a character. His history of drinking and arson, even though the arson charges were from years prior, was used to paint him as a destructive person capable of such an act. It was a classic case of playing the man, not the ball. Think about the sheer scale of the Great Flood of 1993. It was a natural disaster that affected 9 states, caused an estimated $20 billion in damages, and destroyed or damaged over 50,000 homes. It was a force of nature, powerful and indiscriminate. The central, nagging question in the James Scott case is this: did one man with a shovel and a selfish motive really cause a catastrophe of this magnitude? Or was he simply a convenient person to blame for an inevitable failure? For decades, James Scott has maintained his innocence from behind bars. His appeals have been denied, and he remains in prison, serving a life sentence. The case has been featured in documentaries and legal journals, often cited as a textbook example of a potential wrongful conviction. It highlights the dangers of relying on incentivized testimony and the power of a narrative to overwhelm a lack of hard evidence. What makes this story so enduringly fascinating is that it's at a strange crossroads. On one hand, you have the almost cartoonish narrative of a bumbling fool whose selfish desire for a night of freedom leads to biblical level destruction. It's a story that sounds like it was made up for a movie. On the other hand, you have a deeply troubling legal case that raises serious questions about our justice system. Was James Scott a malicious saboteur or the unluckiest man in Missouri, in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong reputation? The truth may never be known for certain. The physical evidence is long gone, washed away by the very floodwaters at the center of the case. All we're left with is the story, a story of a town drowned, a man imprisoned for life, and a lingering, powerful doubt. It forces us to ask ourselves how much proof is enough and how easily a person can be turned into a monster when society needs someone to blame. Thanks for watching. If you found this case as intriguing as I do, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into a fascinating story. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think he did it? See you next time.